Good morning. I'm from Peru, I'm sorry. Hello and welcome everyone to the last session of this webinar. My name is Aníbal Galvez, and I will be the co-moderator with Cesar Bazan. This session, we have the closing conference, thinking through multiple crises, sociological contributions to understanding a global pandemic, by our speaker, Dr. Alke Jenss. Alke is a senior researcher at Arnold Bergstresa Institute in Freiburg and responsible for the research cluster contested governance at the institute. She holds a PhD in sociology from Philipps University, Marburg, Germany. And during she studies social forces, how they transform the state and shape specific policies by looking at the cases of militarized security in Colombia and Mexico. Her current research is situated at the intersection of critical political economy, state theory, and urban security studies, with particular reference to questions of scalar reorganization in Latin America. For example, at the moment, she's studying the effects of austerity and competitiveness planning on urban insecurity experienced by different social strata. She has published in journals like Globalization's Political Geography, the State Criminal Journal, and Global Crime. So, please, we all receive to Dr. Alke Jenss. Please, Doctor.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much, Aníbal, for that presentation, and thanks very much to Cesar Bazan and to Sheila Hernandez for inviting me. So this is a great pleasure, and I will probably have to start by apologizing that I haven't been able to be there during the whole webinar. As you can imagine, as well, with probably all of you, I've had multiple meetings and childcare and so on. So it's not so easy, but that's probably the same for all of you. So I'll try to think through this global pandemic with you and take up a few of the things that have been said. I'll start with an argument and a caveat, sort of I want to be careful in a way. What I would like to argue is that there are at least two axes of inquiry that global and legal sociology can highlight and could also further develop in relation to the pandemic. So first would be looking at the pandemic through a lens of inequality at different scales. So not just at the scale of urban society, for example, but always related to global inequalities. And the second would be relating these intersected inequalities to state institutions, or highlighting the relations that inequalities have with state institutions which also may opt for increasingly punitive strategies in the face of crisis, as we've seen when we were just talking about prisons. In the pandemic and with the renewed protests of Black Lives Matter in the US and elsewhere, it's more than clear, I think, that the effects of these are often deadly, and that there are state policies that accept death as a collateral. And I think legal sociology, or sociology of law, can actually highlight how this relation between inequality and punitive strategies plays out in various spaces. And now you have presented papers on topics, and I've opted for talking about three social spaces that somehow relate to the three panels that we've been talking about. So this would be the home, the prison, and the hospital. I will look at those three, and I will use a wild mix of examples and illustrations, and maybe that serves for a further discussion, or for that maybe it serves as food for thought at least. So now the caveat: I'm not a sociologist of law, even though I'm a sociologist who sometimes deals with the topic of law. But I come from critical security studies and state theory, as Aníbal has said. So maybe some things I say will sound less familiar or will be a different perspective, but I've tried to make the linkages clear, and I'll try to clear things up in the discussion as well.
let me start with global inequalities. So global inequalities as a lens implies both the articulation of racialization and class. I've been reading Stuart Hall a lot lately, who talks precisely this articulation, how it actually plays out in different societies. And it implies also understanding of rights and their socioeconomic and political implications. So a broad understanding of rights and what they imply. If we look at how these inequalities play out during the pandemic in different spaces, sociology of law, I would say, and you can correct me, can help us understand how inequalities are formalized into law or highlight their specific interplay with existing regulations. And of course, the global pandemic isn't new, right? So, I mean, we've all been flooded, I think, with pictures of the so-called Spanish flu and like earlier waves of diseases that have gone across boundaries or borders. But I think what has become clear here is that both race and class play a significant role for how someone experiences disease in general, but particularly during a pandemic. There's a brilliant postdoc at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, Dr. Edna Bonhomme, who has called racism the most dangerous pre-existing condition for COVID vulnerability in the US, because people that are racialized as Black are less likely to have health insurance, more likely to continue to work, etc. And we are increasingly clearly seeing people racialized as Black as victims of both the disease and of economic crisis. But that socially and politically produced and exacerbated vulnerability is complemented by exorbitant unemployment rates, for example, and socioeconomic conditions, which in themselves are at a moment of crisis, not only through the pandemic. One example where we can document this is the different meaning and legal implications of unemployment rates, which intersect with highly unequal labor regimes. Often there's low wage, and that has been criticized in a lot of critical political economy literature, obviously. So if we look at the US, these are the numbers of full-time employment that have absolutely plummeted in April. But you can see that they were already on a downward trend before that. And this is just randomly taking the US as an example. But also in Peru, if we look at the unemployment rates, they have been going up very highly. But I would say what this lens of global inequalities tells us is that unemployment means different things in a highly unequal world. So in Peru, for example, these numbers will not even cover people that are not in formal employment, that are in informal employment, or that are trying to make ends meet by daily tasks that they fulfill. In Colombia, for example, which is a case that I study and where I talk a lot with colleagues there, is that the pandemic has particularly affected those that live off informal work and lack any legal protection in terms of labor regimes, but also pay their accommodation, for example, daily or weekly. So they have very little, or they have very little means of reacting to those crises, and they've very quickly been at the risk of displacement as well. And that leads me, so these are just examples, right? But that leads me to what I called one of the social spaces where I can see how the pandemic plays out, is the home. So middle-class people obviously have had the means to socially isolate ourselves much more. It's a privilege to stay at home, I think. And it's been clearly how markers of class and race have meant that people had to go out, had to be regularly on the street, for example. And I think what is happening here is an externalization of risk to those that had to remain outside the home. In Germany, for example, this goes further than the home. I would say it's externalized outside the borders even. For example, agricultural workers have been flown in, for example, from Romania, have suffered abysmal working and housing conditions and have suffered high rates of infection. Their flying in is presented as an exception to the actual regulations under the pandemic conditions. And at the same time, labor laws are not implemented at all in their favor in general. So it adds insult to injury, really. They are presented as essential workers, but they don't receive protection. Instead, German politicians have naturalized their high infection rates and externalized them. In Peru, for example, as another example, it seems that the roofed markets have become places of spreading the virus, which again disproportionately affects those that have to sell and buy on a daily basis. So not only market workers, but also possibly domestic workers. In the US, employees of the Metropolitan Transit Authority in New York have had significantly higher rates of infection and lack legal protection, but are seen as essential workers as well. But that doesn't exactly help them, right? This kind of discourse. And of course, as some of you have mentioned, legal sociology can also highlight how the home may not be a safe place at all, and how gendered violence has risen all over the globe. And at the same time, if we think of the home in broader terms, I would say that this is also the place for legal sociology to push for analysis of land rights, autonomy, and the relationality of different property regimes. As, for example, indigenous communities in Latin America are particularly vulnerable to the disease, but may in cases with land rights be even better equipped to isolate and formulate a social response instead of an individualized response. And I know, of course, that sociology of law has for a long time pointed towards the extreme hierarchies in accessing state protection and justice systems. Once again, a German example that for me relates very much to differentiation in housing and in the staying at home discourse is that high rises are increasingly presented as risky places during the pandemic, but this presentation links them to being placed, well, or presents them as being places where supposedly unruly, undisciplined migrant people live. So large families that have big gatherings despite the rules, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this presentation that is not accurate. There've been quite a few counter statements that have now come out and that expose how racialized inequality is part of that narrative. Well, when I look around in my city, for example, Freiburg, the city center is full of people. Already weeks ago, I accidentally came across hundreds of people at the local lake that were bathing themselves. These mostly white and middle class people are not mentioned. They're not sanctioned, and they're not presented as unruly. So legal sociology, I think, could link the narratives about particular groups and housing, their alleged being undisciplined, and the alleged ungovernability, and the sanctions that are enacted. Another area, I think, where we can see these things is the hospital. And I think it's probably clear that, and very well easily said, treating the population's health as a commodity has been literally lethal. So the loss of public health services has been a long time in the making, of course. In each country, we can analyze the numbers, for example, the shrinking numbers of ICU beds. So the fact that we are seeing cuts to wages of hospital workers even now is a result of the interrelation of the pandemic and the treatment of health as a sector that needs to generate profit. That is a political decision, right? It's not a necessity. For instance, you might have seen the protest just 2 days ago by French doctors and nurses asking for humane wages, and they were policed. The protest was stopped and blocked by the police, and people were arrested. One striking example where this broader condition of the health sector comes out is the San Juan de Dios hospital in the center of Bogotá in Colombia, a public hospital that was abandoned in the 2000s and to which a number of both health workers and patients kept going despite its closing, because it was a public, it was part of the public health sector and still provided that service in a way. If anyone, for those of you who speak Spanish, I can only recommend, there's a podcast about the history of this hospital with Radio Ambulante, and there's a link here in the presentation if you're interested. So I think this is very clear where the pandemic relates to the broader crisis conditions. And then, of course, we have the prison, and you've just talked about that. I will not repeat all of that. I think it's quite clear that punitive policies, again, are not new, but are being brought into position now again. I rely on authoritarian neoliberalism literature, where scholars have conceptualized the convergence of authoritarian measures, coercive measures, and formal democracy, with a particular economic policy. So for instance, the increased and open use of coercion in protests, for example, the increased processing of social tensions through coercive means. And I think legal sociology or sociology of law can really highlight how the past years, a number of political controversies have been constitutionalized. So moved away from an arena where they can be contested and protested. For example, the way state budgets are organized and how, so it's been constitutionalized, for example, in many countries that states are not supposed to go into debt anymore. While this is, again, a political issue. And at the same time, openly punitive policies have been put into place. So there's an articulation between those neoliberal policies of finance, for example, and increasingly authoritarian coercive rule. And for you, probably lawfare is a term that you're quite familiar with and that legal scholars use more. Much of this is not the result of the COVID-19 crisis, of course. Let me cite Carlos Fausto, professor of anthropology at the Museu Nacional Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, but it's true of other places as well. He says, with regard to the Brazilian situation, at the current juncture of Brazilian history, in which the far right is in power and the government promises a not so disguised genocide policy against indigenous peoples, ghosts are all the time creeping out from the colonial wardrobe. So it's difficult to disentangle what is part of this political conjuncture from what is the result of the pandemic per se. And I think we can see that in a lot of places, but it's precisely our task to disentangle that, right? As I said, we can see the marriage of authoritarian punitive strategies and reactions to the pandemic elsewhere. So for example, with the health inequities in the prison system, the higher rates of infection, the lack of protection of the most basic rights. Also, again, the overrepresentation of racialized persons in prison systems. And in some places with strict lockdown, hundreds have been arrested for not respecting quarantine rules. Fair enough, but there's no distinction between were these people just not obedient, or did they have to go out because they lack any stable income? In how far are they limited in the options that they actually have? Also, at Europe's and the US border in particular, contained populations are particularly vulnerable to the pandemic due to the conditions they are forced to live in, so-called detention centers, for example. But if there are major outbreaks there, then this will again serve as a self-fulfilling prophecy that paints them as dangerous. And I think it has become quite clear and put at the forefront by the renewed Black Lives Matter.
Time's already up, so can we try to
Yes,
finish
I'll wrap
quickly?
up.
Thank you.
I think it's become quite clear and put at the forefront by the renewed Black Lives Matter protests that the normalization of police and military violence against particular social groups, read as deviant, have become part of crisis reaction strategies in the longer term. So sometimes that kind of violence even facilitates economic expansion. We can talk about that in the discussion. And just to conclude, I think sociology of law can, of course, go far beyond these three spaces that I've briefly sketched in analyzing the current conjuncture, but it should not forget the multiple intersecting crises that the pandemic has only exacerbated or brought to more widespread attention. This has been said, and I want to insist on that. We are, of course, already seeing protests as a reaction to the overlaps of crisis. And politically, if a lockdown saves lives, it's of course necessary. But analytically, if we cannot overlook the tensions and the coercive strategies that some political actors are employing and expanding. One thing I think that we can do in global and legal sociology then is to analyze the criminalization of particular lives and the normalization of their death as part of crisis strategies. Thanks. I'm looking forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much for these interesting presentations. Now we have 10 minutes for discussion, so I encourage all the participants to make your questions or your comments, so please. Let me see if we already have questions in the chat.
Hello, I will make a question.
Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, so Alke, thank you so much for your presentation and these nice slides. My intervention is more a reflection than the question, because I agree with your conclusion. You had conclusion, no? This pandemic normalized the diet. This is very strong, I think, learn for this crisis. And I think this is the conclusion for countries on the North Global, because I think this experience with the diet in another countries is very common now. So I think for the countries in the Global North, this experience and this crisis is more strong than the countries in the Global South. I don't know if you agree with this, or maybe you have two comparative in your presentation with Colombia. So I think it's different in the South and in the North, with the people live this crisis now. And it's very interesting. You talk about three topics: home, hospital, and prison. And I think with these three topics, you can make a really nice radiography about the crisis. So congratulations and thank you so much.
Aníbal, do you want me to answer or to go into discussion right now, or are we collecting? I don't know.
I suggest you answer this question now while we are collecting more questions.
I would really, maybe just as a thing, I would really appreciate people to comment on that and to like think what their conclusions are for the seminar and for the things that you've discussed. I think, Sheila, yeah, I would say that a lens of global inequalities is probably, or its aim would probably be to really carve out how does it play out at different sites, at different locations. And it's different. For example, I tried to say that briefly when I talked about the unemployment rates and so on, where I said, well, the impacts of unemployment can be very different in a place where there's a lot of formal employment, but that might not mean anything in a place where formal employment is only for a minority, right? So it depends a lot, I think, on the different social relations that we can make out and the different actors that are there. We've also seen large differences within Europe, for example, I think, where you could see how things like very things that you couldn't control, like when would the pandemic hit our country, for example, was something that at the beginning in March, no one knew. And in Germany, I would say part of this was just luck, right? So it didn't spread as much, while in Italy it had already spread. So things like that play out as well, but also the ways in which it's done, and and the conditions that these governance strategies meet, right? How far is there already, or to what extent is there are crisis mechanisms already in place, or to what extent are people already suffering from different crises, and etc. So I think, yeah, the ultimate aim would be to look at different locations and both relate them, but also look at how does it play out there in the particular place.
Well, thank you. Now we can receive more questions. I think we have a question from Nermin Abbasi. I know you want me to read, or you'd like to do it by yourself? Can we open his microphone, please?
Yeah, I will open his microphone. Nermin Abbasi.
Yeah, perfect. Hi, Alke. It's nice to see you again, even virtually. I had a small question, which is basically like also like a sort of like theoretical problem for me. Like in the way I understand things, like how would you make the difference between institutionalized structure, like for example, on how we are used to dealing with minorities before COVID, and then like how would you relate to the sociology of law? Like would be just like in the case that, for example, law is just here a tool that renders like dealing with such crisis worse or better? Like how would you, for example, comment on that? Like I was just like curious to hear your opinion on this. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe on institutionalization, maybe that is a question also for the others that are really legal scholars or people that work in the sociology of law more specifically. But I would say, so from my analytical perspective, institutionalization is something that happens, and that is always, that happens as a result of political negotiations, arrangements, and struggles. And it depends on power relations, what is then institutionalized. And I think there is a lot of contingency there, so you can't necessarily know in advance what is going to happen, what is being institutionalized, and what is formalized. But in the end, the fact that something is formalized, or the formalized rules that are there, of course, have an impact on the following political struggles. So if, for example, I don't know, if we talk about those punitive policies and coercive strategies, and there's a lot of exceptions to police behavior, for example, and they're not usually persecuted for it, or they have a formalized regulation where they can quite freely act as they wish, then that will mean that protest cannot play out in the same ways as if police had more restrictions, right? So I think it's there's the reciprocity. What interests me is the reciprocity between institutionalization and political struggle and the negotiations around it. So how is something really, why is something formalized and something else isn't?
Well, do we have another question? If not, I'd like to comment something. There's another a big issue, I think, in Latin American countries, at least here in Peru. I think we're having problems with not only with people in cities, but in rural areas as well, mainly with indigenous people, which actually here in Peru, they are not they cannot be considered a minority. But there's big problems because in the area where indigenous peoples live here in Peru, they have no access to hospitals. They have no access to, sometimes they don't have enough access to the internet for online educations as we are having in the cities. And there's information that many people are dying because they are not accessing to the hospitals, but these deaths are not being counted. I mean, they are not being considered by official data. So there are no statistics about them. Sometimes there are some news that like 100 people, 200 people have died in some specific indigenous people. But in this moment, there's no much information about that, but it's clear that this crisis is more profound with these populations, with these peoples. Well, this is another comment that I just want to make. I think we have another question from Paz Irarrazabal. Can we open her microphone, please?
I think it is, yeah?
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Please,
yes,
Paz, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. And I was thinking about, yeah, this concept of authoritarian neoliberalism. And also what you say about the difficulty to understand if there was a change of the policies, or it's kind of how they are interlinked, and maybe there, I think there are some continuation of some policies in this neoliberal authoritarianism. So how to know, if the pandemic is making change of the police, or is even making them strength, giving them strength, like to. So I think that was very interesting, and I would like to know if you can give us some example when you have seen this interlink and you cannot make the difference between what was going on before the pandemic and now.
So yeah, that's really difficult because I'm only starting to understand some of these things as well, and only starting to delve into that. I think some things where we can see how the pandemic plays into longer policies is, for example, when we look at Brazil and the numbers there, we have some numbers of hectares of the Amazon burning, for example, compared to the last years, how that is growing, and how despite, or maybe not despite the pandemic, a lot of mining deals have gone through in Latin America, for example. So I've just read that there's, well, concessions being given across the continent to large mining firms again. So there's seems to be a new wave. And I think what we can see is that it sort of exacerbates existing policies, but it's not as publicized as it may be otherwise if there wasn't the pandemic. So now everyone's talking about the pandemic, or at least that is my impression. I don't know, that obviously depends on the context again. But so some things are pushed through because it's possible to push it through now, with a lot of, I don't know, decrees and emergency regulations and so on. But I think we have to look very closely at also, again, the institutionalization processes. So how are things decided, who is pushing them and who isn't. So yeah, maybe that is a way to look at those. Look at how have things changed in comparison to the last years, and how is the process of deciding about that. Maybe. Examples, you asked about examples, and what occurs to me now is the example of Brazil, but also in Colombia, at least what I'm seeing is that the pandemic hasn't stopped dispossession, for example, in the peripheries of Bogota, so where people are being driven out of their homes that they've built supposedly on risky ground and so on. So these things are taking place, and the pandemic is not a reason to stop it, for example. I would also have questions to the others. I'm not so sure about how some of these things play into debates in the sociology of law, and how would you, for example, from your perspective as legal scholars or sociologists of law, see the current protests of Black Lives Matter, for example? What would you think, or what is your perspective on that? Within the scope of the pandemic, actually, obviously.
May I say something?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, Black Lives Matter a little later. The question about how does sociology of law come in, how to deal with minorities. That was a question I was asked yesterday already, again. So we here have a tension in the corona epidemic between decisions which are made, and are they based on rules, on laws, or not? And who has the authority to decide what is government allowed to do, what parliament? And then there are rules which are there and which are applied. And the question is, how are they applied? And then there are rules which are made particularly to cope with the crisis. And the question is it temporary rules, or will they last? So this is the point about sociology of law, and you have to apply it to all these different things. Now, minorities, are they done justice? I've said yesterday, in times of crisis, life for minorities always gets more difficult. It's very bad. Their rights should be observed as other people's rights, but people are so busy with all the constraints created by the epidemic, that injustice happens. The point is, and this is what I foresee for Germany, but I can't speak for other countries, what is going to happen when the system has stabilized again. And I guess our law courts will get a lot to do in the coming years, dealing with all these things which haven't worked well. They have to deal with, was it right that government has taken this decision? Will there be people who ask for damages? Who's got an unjust treatment? Can they ask for damages, etc., etc.? There will be a huge, huge amount of legal work which can be done. And I guess the lawyers are already sitting there and trying to find out how to forge that kind of business. But of course, it's good. We have to check how the system reacted well, to know what to do in the future. And of course, if injustice has been done, people are entitled to be compensated for it. So this, of course, may be a very German attitude, and I'm well aware that in other countries this may not function that well as it does in Germany. And of course, even there's injustice. Now, Black Lives Matter, the movement, well, we have discussed at several points yesterday and today that an unstable system creates the fertile ground for these questions to blow up. And this is a whole field to discuss. So yeah. Yeah, okay. I leave it there. Okay.
Right, thank you so much. I think now we're going to listen to Sheila Fernandez for last words from the organizer teams. Please, Sheila.
Can I just maybe have a very quick
Yes.
answer to what
Please,
Yes,
Ulrike
please.
said? Yeah?
Yeah,
Just,
yeah.
Yes,
just
please.
very, very quick. So maybe just to reiterate what I was saying, I think what we have to look at, even if we look at the legal implications, is that injustice isn't a necessity, obviously. I mean, we probably all agree on that, and that there's, before something is institutionalized or formalized, there's political discussion, arrangement, etc., and also struggle. And I think I would find it really interesting to have an intersection between law scholars and those that study these kind of struggles and the movements, for example. I think that could be really fruitful. But thanks.
Thank you. Now, Sheila, please.
Okay, thank you, Aníbal. Thank you, Alke. Thank you so much to all the people for saying these 2 days in this seminar. I hope the webinar was interesting for everyone. And especially, I would like to say thanks for our speakers and moderators for participating. And I hope to see you all in another time. And please take care and stay healthy. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we have finished with this last session of this webinar. Thank you so much for these 2 interesting days.